Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
This is Jane. She thinks she's just filling her car, but she's also filling the air with cancer-causing toxic chemicals used to boost octane in gas. What doesn't burn in the engine enters the air and your lungs, even your heart and brain. Bad for everyone, especially kids. Ethanol is a natural octane booster, clean burning and non-toxic. More ethanol means less scary stuff in our gas and in the air we breathe. And that makes your choice pretty plain, Jane. American Ethanol, cleaner air for Nebraska.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Roy Smith explains why he never sells soybeans in February. Dave Aiken outlines property tax reform efforts in Nebraska. Bruce Anderson discusses the quality of corn stalks for grazing, and Laura Thompson talks about using aerial imagery in crop production. Roy Smith is our market analyst this week. With the help of the U.S. Department of Agriculture's January crop report on the 12th, corn and soybean markets experienced noteworthy prices. The March corn futures contract closed Friday after the report at $3.46 per bushel. That was a new low. The March soybean futures contract, however, bounced higher. Previously, it had dropped 71 cents from its winter high of $10.21 in early December, which was its best mark since late July. On a cold Tuesday afternoon, we talked with Roy inside at Midwest Farmers Co-op near Plattsmouth and began by asking about the recent market movements.
Well, it's been kind of interesting to watch because they've done exactly the opposite. Corn has been more or less flat for a long time, going back into August. Soybeans have been in a nice uptrend, and it looked like maybe we'd found the secret in the soybean market because we got some government reports that for a change were positive, but a couple days this week the market just kind of fell out of bed, and gee, I hate to see that because it's hard getting it back once you lose it, and hopefully we had some farmers that got some beans sold, and so that's where we are right now.
Like you said, since fall, corn has been gradually trending lower. Is that uncommon to see, that line downward with really no bumps in the middle?
Well, there's nothing, no bumps in the middle, like you say, and people look for some signal to do something, and in the corn market, there's just been nothing to do. In the soybean market, there have been something to do, and about the time everybody's ready to pull the trigger, it sort of fell out of bed. And so wintertime is not usually a good time to be making sales, and this year certainly proves that.
Yeah, you've said that January and February are there to make you frustrated. Would you set some targets for corn right now, or what do you think you should hope to get?
As opposed to setting some targets, my recommendation for a couple of months has been, divide your crop up into increments and sell a little bit as we go along. We raise the crop to sell it, and nobody wants to sell below the cost of production, including me, but we need to get this, to keep this stuff moving so that we don't end up, I have a terminology I use, getting stuck with last year's corn, agricultural acupuncture, getting stuck with last year's corn. Well, don't do that. That's the best thing I can say. Don't do that. Don't get yourself in a position where you have to move something in August or September. So
let's talk about soybeans, because we're approaching an interesting time when you never sell soybeans, and that's the month of February. Does that hold again this year?
That still holds in my book until I see something that proves it different. But now, never sell soybeans in February. That's a real strong indication. But is that going to hold true this year? I wish I could say I know, but I don't. But there's beans are out there. South America is getting ready to have a big harvest. That's going to be another factor, and so I say if you got beans in storage and you're thinking of holding them, don't hold them too long. You know, get rid of them by the 1st of February or the 1st of March, somewhere along in there, because when that South American crop comes on, it could get ugly for a little while. I still believe that long-term trend that we saw back there when we were talking, it may hold, and I hope it does hold, but right now there's nothing that says it has to.
What's the importance of watching basis movement right now?
Well, the basis movement should be an indicator of what the actual supply and demand is. And I say should be because, boy, it's not doing well this year. But in general, once we get past the holidays, past November and December, and focusing on what's out there, you'd like to think that there may be a little bit of a rally. If there is, focus on the terminology a little bit, because it may come and go real fast and leave you in a situation that we were talking about before.
I want to ask one final question about forward marketing. We saw in the latest stocks report that corn and soybean stocks were both higher than last year, granted perhaps with bigger crops. But in this area where there's not much irrigation, you don't do a lot of, or you didn't do a lot of forward contracting. That being said, how do you use forward contracting so you don't get in a situation where you're stuck with all of the crop acupuncture?
I think you set targets, set goals, and again, be ready to pull the trigger, and don't carry those beans over into August, because that's a sure trap that you're probably going to end up getting less than what you wanted, or less than what it looks like you should have with the size of crop that we've got.
Next week, Elaine Cubb will join us to look at corn and soybean markets. The Nebraska Unicameral is 2 weeks into its 2018 legislative session. Nebraska Extension's Dave Aiken says the debate around property tax reform for ag land has already begun. As we've told you previously, the per-farm average spent on real estate and personal property taxes in Nebraska is higher than in any other state measured by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. That cost in 2016 was nearly $23,000 per operation, $9,600 more than California, the second most expensive state. This isn't the first time lawmakers have addressed relief. 2 years ago, they added money to the state's property tax credit program for ag land, but no major legislation passed last session. Dave joined us Tuesday to outline the significant bills now on the table.
We've got two serious proposals on the table, one from Senator Erdman that would cut property tax, issue a property income tax credit for 30% of property tax payments, and the governor has a similar proposal that would be about half that.
First, tell me more about Erdman's proposal.
Okay, this is the one that is tied to the initiative petition that's also being circulated across the state, and it would basically, you would get a state of Nebraska income tax credit that would be refundable for half of the property taxes that you paid that went towards schools. Now, across the state, the average is 60% of property tax goes to K-12 education. So half of that would be 30%. So it's roughly, you know, a credit for 30% of your property taxes paid.
Outline the governor's proposal.
Well, the governor's proposal takes a similar approach, but it would be 10% instead of 30%, but it would be 10% of your property taxes paid. And it's also part of the governor's budget proposal, and there's income tax reductions and stuff associated with that as well.
So tell me how these two proposals compare or differ with each other.
Well, they both go through the state income tax credit system, so that's something that's new that we haven't seen before. In addition, the governor's is paid for in his budget proposal. So it's what they call revenue neutral. Under Senator Erdman's proposal, the legislature would have to find, would either have to make spending cuts or else would have to find out how to make up for the reduction in state revenue because of all the credits that would be given for the property taxes.
You mentioned this, but can you tell me more about the possible petition that could put this on the ballot?
You bet. The petition has been filed with the Secretary of State, so that a petition process has been initiated, and it's basically Senator Erdman's bill. And if it were not, if people weren't happy with what happened to property taxes this year, they could get that put on the ballot, and then the people would have a chance to basically say, yes, we want to enact this as a statute. So it's not, it'd be a statute, not a constitutional amendment.
How do you think these efforts compare to previous efforts of property tax reform?
Well, there are some things that that have been talked about in the past in terms of how land is valued for agricultural purposes and things like that. I think those would all could be a part of the eventual outcome for this. But these are new approaches, and they're basically saying the old approach hasn't worked the way we wanted, so we're going to try something different.
Do you have a prediction as to how this plays out?
Well, I think it's going to be, it may be the major or one of the major topics for discussion in the legislature this year. The thing, if you're looking at property tax reform, you've got two proposals that are both very meaningful, and compared to what we've looked at in the past, not that far apart. So I think there may be more of an opportunity to try to find common ground on this than there has been in the past. But we've got some budget challenges, and so we'll have to wait and see how it all plays out.
Dave will join us again in future episodes of Market Journal to update the property tax reform efforts. The January Nebraska Farmer says Belden Farmer and U.S. Soybean Export Council Chairman Jim Miller took part in a historic trip last year. During President Donald Trump's visit to China in November, Miller represented the U.S. soybean industry during 2 signing ceremonies in Beijing. Miller also serves as a director for the American Soybean Association. In the January Nebraska Farmer, he discusses the details of his trip, the key issues involved, and what the future holds for American soybean exports to China. Nebraska Extension forage specialist Bruce Anderson says weather conditions can impact the quality of corn stalks and winter pastures. Nebraska experienced its 11th wettest October on record. Bruce says that wet fall, followed by winter snow coming and going, could change what livestock get out of those fields. Bruce joined us earlier this week to explain what producers need to consider when letting animals graze corn stalks or winter pastures.
Well, I think, like everybody knows, things have really been up and down so far this winter. We've had a little bit of snow here. Earlier in the season, we had some rain. Lots of real cold weather, and then now we're starting to warm up some more. So it's kind of whatever you want, you're going to experience at some point, but you're going to have to go through some misery to get there.
How do those weather conditions impact the quality of corn stalks or winter pastures?
Well, when you take a look at what we're hoping to accomplish with some of those materials, they're pretty dormant, and they've got whatever nutrients they're going to have stored within them. When we start getting various weather conditions, especially wet conditions, things that can create some moisture like either rain or snow that melts, some of the nutrients that are in there that are quite soluble can actually get washed out of those corn stalks or out of the winter pasture. And as a result, those nutrients disappear, and what's left behind is often a lot less nutrition, and the animals are not going to perform as well if that's the only thing they have in their diet.
Give me an idea of what nutrients would be at risk of loss.
Okay, primarily the things that we lose are more of our soluble types of nutrients. Some of the carbohydrates, the sugars disappear very quickly. Starch is pretty soluble, and that goes pretty fast. Some of the minerals will wash out pretty quickly. Surprisingly, protein is fairly stable and stays in there, so once in a while we actually see the protein as a percent of what's remaining increasing a bit. Fiber especially goes way up as the soluble carbohydrates are washed away. So we have, a more fibrous, a coarser type of feed being available to the animals.
So if the producer thinks that they've lost some of these nutrients, do they need to supplement earlier than normal?
Well, they probably do. I think there's a whole bunch of things that they also need to be looking at. You know, when you get these kind of weather conditions that are dry and wet and cold and warm, one of the other things that often happens, especially in the grazing situation, is that we get a lot of mud. We get a lot of tracking of dirt up there on those tissues. And so not only do we see a decline in the quality of the feed that's available, but also availability or palatability declines. And so we have both a potential intake as well as a quality of the intake type of situation going on. And if we have that happening, certainly supplementation becomes something we have to be more serious about and consider what we need to be supplementing with. Normally, protein is one of the first things we think about when we're supplementing on some of these feedstuffs. But when we're dealing with the weather type of scenarios, energy also becomes an important consideration. So looking at what kind of supplements we have, oftentimes some of the distillers and those types of supplements provide quite a bit of energy as well as protein. They can be especially effectively used in those kinds of situations, Jeff.
In which situations would mold or spoilage be a concern?
Well, we might see a little bit out on cornstalks or pasture out in the wild, but for the most part it's going to be found in bales. And one of the things that we often don't realize with baled forages is that these bales can take up moisture. They get rain on them. The cornstalk bales in particular are not usually real tightly packed, and so moisture soaks into those situations. And in those kind of conditions, we very easily can start getting some mold and spoilage developing out there that will reduce both the quality and the acceptability of that feed.
In those bales, would you recommend testing?
Well, I think we always want to be testing to know what we got there to start with. Testing doesn't do a great deal for us if we're looking at a mold type of situation, although we oftentimes can detect that we've got mold in there by pulling out samples and seeing what they're looking like, seeing some of the fungi growing on there and giving us a clue that there may be some nutritional problems with it. But the testing still will give us some good information as to what kind of supplementation might be needed in order to use that kind of feed resource effectively.
Are there any situations where the weather's severe enough that you need to think about reducing stocking rates or pulling off early?
Well, I think certainly if we start getting a lot of snow cover or ice in particular, both of those can really restrict access to any of these feedstuffs. And when that happens, we always have to have some kind of reserve feed available. Maybe we only need to use it for a few days and we get these 40, 50 degree temperatures to melt all the problems away. But maybe it'll stay on there for a long time and we have to be using some of the conserved feeds for a longer period of time.
You can find more information about cornstalk grazing through resources on UNL's beef website at beef.unl.edu. As you've heard in previous interviews on Market Journal, emerging drone technologies may be able to help farmers and ranchers with scouting and monitoring crops or livestock. Researchers have noted, though, one of the challenges is learning how to use drones in a profitable way. Nebraska Extension's Laura Thompson works with producers in the Nebraska On-Farm Research Network who conduct trials in their own fields. She also used drones and aerial imagery extensively during the 2017 cropping season. Laura joined us earlier this week to explain how those tools may be able to help growers.
So for a lot of our on-farm research studies, we've been looking at how we can use drones and airplanes to collect imagery to help us see what's going on with our on-farm research studies, looking at things that might have occurred in the field, maybe some stresses that we weren't aware of, or just looking at how different treatments that we're evaluating, how those have performed. So there's some advantages to being able to see from above, having some frequent imagery to really monitor the progression of those studies as well.
I think when people hear drones, they think that's synonymous with aerial imagery. What's the difference when you say those two words?
So we're using both platforms to collect imagery. With the airplane, we're getting imagery collected generally on a more frequent basis, and the way the airplane collects the imagery, they're able to take a snapshot over the entire field, usually in one shot because they're a lot higher up. With the drones, we're lower, and to get a complete image of the field, we fly the drones in systematic patterns, collecting hundreds or thousands of pictures across the field and then stitching all of those images together to create a complete map that has really good resolution, though. You can see a lot of detail in those images, but generally not flown quite as frequently as you might fly an airplane over a field.
Can you give me a specific example of something you looked at in the last growing season?
Sure. So one example that we've looked at is monitoring how sudden death syndrome in soybeans occurs spatially within a field. So we're testing different soybean seed treatments such as Olevo to try to look at the impact of that on sudden death syndrome. So one thing we're interested in is how is that treatment performing in areas that are higher incidence of sudden death syndrome or lower incidences of sudden death syndrome. So kind of using that imagery to help us identify where those hot spots are.
We've talked about Project Sense on the program before, trying to measure nitrogen use throughout the season, determine when the crop needs it. How can aerial imagery or drones help with that?
Right, so in the Project Sense, we're using crop canopy sensors to look at the corn crop and monitor the status of the corn throughout the season to make those nitrogen determinations. So we can use a similar system, mounting a sensor to a drone, flying over the field systematically, collecting all those images and stitching it together, and use that data to make a nitrogen prescription for the field. So one advantage of that approach is that we're able to fly over the field much more frequently and really monitor the status of the corn to find out when it's going to be needing that nitrogen, and then go ahead and make that variable rate prescription. And another advantage is that we're able to go in and do that monitoring in advance of having a high clearance applicator in there, or in some cases go into fields that maybe are not really conducive for having a high clearance applicator, maybe a lot of hills or slopes or terraces, and do that monitoring, determine if we need an in-season nitrogen application, and then in some cases have that applied with an airplane.
What do you see when you look at the pictures that you get back?
So with a drone, you could have different type of equipment mounted on it. So the kind of standard that people may have, it probably comes with the drone, would just be a standard camera that would take pictures similar to what you would take off of your cell phone. Just a simple color picture, but generally very high quality pictures. The other option is you can mount sensors that look at specific wavelengths, and a lot of people are interested in looking at things in the near infrared portion of the spectrum, so portions that we don't really see with our eye that can be really informative to what the crop status and health is. So we're interested in using those sensors that are looking at specific wavelengths and into the wavelengths that we can't see with our eye, and are really able to see a lot of difference that appears in the field that would not normally be apparent with just the traditional standard imagery.
What have you found to be the challenges in using these tools?
So the technology is still fairly new. There's challenges in getting the sensors integrated and getting those images stitched together. One of the challenges is just the sheer amount of data that you're collecting. You
have done some of these in conjunction with the Nebraska On-Farm Research Network. You have some meetings coming up. How can people learn more about what you've done and the other studies that are going on through the network?
So we will have meetings coming up in February sharing on-farm research results, including some of these using drones to manage nitrogen. And those meetings will be in February. You can learn more about those by visiting cropwatch.unl.edu/farmresearch, and the dates of those upcoming meetings are there. There will be 5 locations across the state, and about 85 or 90 studies will be presented, so a lot of great information.
As Laura mentioned, the Nebraska On-Farm Research Network meetings will take place in February at 5 locations in the state: Meade, Norfolk, Grand Island, Grant, and Alliance. Al Dutcher is off this week, filling in with a weather outlook. Here's Stonie Cooper from the Nebraska State Climate Office.
Hello, Jeff. Looking dapper as usual. Now onto the maps for this week. Saturday shows a storm starting to crank up in southeast Colorado. Starting in the mid-20s statewide, highs for Saturday will range from 35 in the far western panhandle to mid-40s in eastern Nebraska. Except for the northwest Nebraska panhandle, most parts of the state will be mostly clear, and the best possibility for precipitation will be around the Harrison and Chadron areas. Sunday is a different story. Our Colorado system ejects out into the plains and brings strong north winds and snow to much of Nebraska. Except for the very southeast corner of Nebraska, much of the state will start out the morning in the low to mid-20s, with much of the state staying in the 30s except for the southeast, which may hit the low 50s in advance of the cold front. Most of the precipitation will be in the form of snow, but icing is possible in the northeast, so travelers should be careful of conditions across the state. Monday sees the system moving up over the Great Lakes and giving folks east of us a worry. Winds will diminish from west to east, with high pressure building. Lows start in the teens west and 20s east and rising up into the 30s. Some snow will linger in the northeastern corner of Nebraska as the system wraps more moisture around the low. Tuesday starts mostly in the teens statewide and rise up into the 30s. With the system just a memory and the high pressure continuing to build from the west, a nice break as the winds finally die down across the state. A very slight chance of a flurry in the far western panhandle. Wednesday morning will be cold, teens throughout the state to possibly 20 near Fall City. The day will warm though, and everyone except the very northeastern corner should get above freezing. Along with staying below freezing, South Sioux City may see a flurry pass by. Thursday brings more warming with south winds in advance of the next system. With little to no snow on the ground in the southern 2/3, the temps will almost seem spring-like. No precip in the Cornhusker State. Make plans to go ice fishing on Thursday if possible. On Friday, the next Colorado system digs and pumps more warm air in north. The spring-like conditions will continue, but what comes up must come down. This is just setting the stage for a stormy weekend with a preview for the whole state starting with showers, both rain and snow, in the panhandle on Friday. By Friday, we should only see snow on the ground in the very west and northern portions of the state, limited to 2 to 4 inches remaining on the ground. In the week that follows, the Climate Prediction Center is showing a warming above the normal in the east with colder than normal in the west. They're also showing wetter than normal conditions throughout the east, and I'll go out on a limb and predict the week following January 27th will be wet statewide. Tune in next week when Al shows viewers how to delouse your pet with coffee grounds.
Thanks, Stonie. Today's interviews are available individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on corn and soybean prices, property tax reform efforts, cornstalk quality, and aerial imagery. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Next week, Elaine Cubb will be our market analyst. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.